there's a lot you can do to cultivate and develop, yourself and your brain, just with this kind of ancient knowledge and this ancient skill set of, breathing techniques and visualization techniques and different kind of mindfulness and focused attention techniques and stuff like that.
Well, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of HeartMind Happy Hour on this Friday afternoon in North America. And I have with me today special guest neuroscientist Kiefer O'Sullivan. Welcome, Kiefer.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on again, Holly.
Yeah, really excited. Yeah, you were on one of the first shows that I did actually many months ago. So
yeah, way back when.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you back.
Nice.
So thanks so much. Well, let's see. So this is HeartMind Happy Hour. This is my show. I'm your host, Holly Copeland. I'm a human potential coach and scientist, and do these shows because I love to dive into topics on consciousness and brainwave science, and we delve into the mystical and we get into meditation, and it's just been a ton of fun. So really excited for the conversation today. Before we begin, let's come into a moment of presence together, just to center ourselves. So take a couple breaths. Feeling very grateful for the time here, coming into our bodies, coming into the room around us, connecting with the planet and sending tons of positive energy out to everyone. And slowly coming back to begin, and something is beeping. What is beeping?
Like the messenger?
This is not okay. Yes. Messenger is popping up and beeping at me.
People have questions already. What?
Yeah. Okay, I'm hoping that I've got that figured out and it's still not going to beep at me. The intricacies of Facebook Live.
Mm-hmm. Through Zoom.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody, I will, I've again got my screen open here on my iPad. So if you ask questions, I'll take some time to look and, maybe in a half hour or something and answer questions as it seems appropriate. So put your questions in the chat box, please, and I'll try to get to them. And without further ado, I want to again welcome my guest, neuroscientist Kiefer O'Sullivan, who's a good friend, and we've had some really fun conversations. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today. And Kiefer has master's degree and bachelor's degree in neuroscience, and you're originally from Ireland.
Yep. Originally from Ireland, but been living stateside for a little over a decade now. So right now I'm in the west side of Los Angeles.
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. And then after your degrees, you went on to work as a consultant and helping in various kind of health applications, working with doctors, correct?
Yeah. And so I became kind of what I often describe as like a private sector neuroscientist, kind of different from kind of my academic upbringings, and working with a lot of different companies, local companies that are doing this kind of, this up and coming consciousness research, meditation, mindfulness, research, in addition to actually applying that to people, because it is such an effective protocol for so many people. And so it's really something that is so blossoming in, the 21st century, both with, the knowledge, the need for that knowledge, and the technology that we now have in the 21st century to really, interface with our brains for the first time in non-invasive ways, where we can actually really start to get to grips with, what are the types of readings we can get? What are the different states of mind, states of consciousness, and really, going down that rabbit hole, as we say, of figuring what is this meditation thing all about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you bring skills that are really needed at this time, for sure, as everybody, especially in our Heart Mind Alchemy project community, they're using devices like the Muse and tracking brainwaves and trying to go deeper in their meditations. And I think a lot of us who aren't neuroscientists have a lot of questions about what does the data really mean? What are we looking for? Yeah, and then other things just about the devices. How noisy are they? um
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It's, you know, we always say that the brain is really one of the most complicated things that humanity is aware of in the known universe. And so it's interesting now that we have finally reached that point where we, you know, anybody can almost start to, you know, crack that egg and start to kind of like look into their brainwaves a little bit. But there's so much for us, even as, you know, even the most esoteric neuroscientists, there's so much for us all to learn that it's really interesting for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and I really am hoping in future shows to have on some of the folks that have joined our community who are developing new devices, and yeah.
Yeah, so many folks from across the board and so many applications, and it's really interesting. This whole industry is fascinating.
Completely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I completely agree. And there's so many directions you can take it, from just cognitive performance and, enhancement, to helping people with real like day-to-day issues like sleep or anxiety. And then there's the whole kind of consciousness, realm. So there's it goes in a lot of directions, right?
Yeah, it's almost like there's something for everybody there, which I really like because at one end, you know, for I almost call it like the purists, right? People that are want like no technology, no kind of any of that stuff. There's a lot you can do to cultivate and develop, you know, yourself and your brain just with this kind of ancient knowledge and this ancient skill set of, you know, breathing techniques and visualization techniques and different kind of mindfulness and focused attention techniques and stuff like that, you know, or for, you know, the brain consciousness type of, you know, bio explorer type of people. There's a lot you can do with, you know, biometrics, as we call them, in terms of measuring your brain and being able to, you know, establish you know, a metric for this is where I am with my brain during a particular task, and then working on different protocols to see if you can, you know, move that dial one way or another. And so almost for the you know the nitty gritty performance junkies type of thing, you know, almost like in the same realm as, you know, when people got very much into lifting weights and working out and, you know, dieting and stuff like that. Now you can do that for your brain and really start to enhance your brain in so many different ways, in, you know, with technology or just with yourself, really, in your own mind and your own attention.
Yeah, completely. I wrote in one of the articles that I wrote, blogged about, to me, this realm of mind training is the next, gym training, physical training equivalent of the, 90s and 2000, early 2000s, that we're just
Yeah,
going to see
yeah,
this
absolutely
explosion
agree. Yeah.
of, mind people who really want to train their mind, and do it in various ways. Obviously, meditation is, there's so many ways that you can enter it, and which is great because everybody has different needs and things that work for them.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in addition to that, I'll add as well that it's, you know, again, you know, something for everybody. I've never really found a person that wouldn't benefit from, you know, this kind of practice that we're all involved in terms of like just meditation or bettering the brain, you know, whether you're on like maybe a corporate side of things, and you're, you know, in big business, or you're just wanting to improve your general focus or your ability to, you know, engage with your professional responsibilities, or if you're just somebody who wants, you know, better life satisfaction. In addition to that, you know, mental health concerns can be addressed with this as well. You know, spiritual experiences are obviously one of the biggest attractors for people, and finding meaning in life and stuff like that. And so from the very, you know, woo woo spiritual to the very practical, almost like corporate end, there's, you know, it's very, you know, everybody can really see how much they can benefit from that in any capacity. And nobody can say that they're, you know, couldn't be benefited by it, which is a really interesting part of the process, I find.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's why the analogy of physical fitness and gyms works so well, because there's basically nobody who wouldn't benefit from some form of physical activity, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So it's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Uh, well, then in that realm of there's something for everybody, and this interest in really what is going on in the brain when you do mind training of various types. Let's dive in a little bit and start to dive in. I wanted, especially for folks who maybe are new to tracking their brain waves and understanding them, give them some basic information to help understand what they should be looking for and in their progress. So maybe we should just start out with a really simple question. I love simple questions. So what are brain waves exactly?
Good question. So brain waves, okay, so basically to start off, our brain is generally considered to be an electrochemical organ, right? And so it communicates between its different components using electrical signals and chemical signals. And both of these are kind of almost combined into a singular process, but they summate, which is to say the kind of the end result of all of this is these rhythmic oscillatory electrical waves that kind of go back and forth between different parts of your brain. That basically occurs through the action of neurons. So you can imagine a neuron is basically like an individual nerve cell. They're the ones that are most commonly seen, and they're basically the most famous ones because they're the kind of like long, kind of wiry ones that you've probably seen them in movies and all these like visualizations where there's that electrical pulse that like travels down them. And so that's basically what a neuron is. And so chemical signals at the top of that neuron that come from other neurons basically trigger that neuron to tell it yes or no, should you fire that electrical pulse? And when you get millions upon millions of those individual neurons that are all linked together in what we call networks or circuits, they can form these particular tracks that will commonly all electrically kind of activate in a singular kind of line. And we'll do that kind of repetitiously in various ways. And so that repetitious kind of electrical activity kind of going down that wire is what we call a brainwave. And so there are many different ways we can measure our brains, and a brainwave is just one of the ways in which we can do that. It's one of the preferred methods because it's actually very non-invasive to get that scan. Obviously, we do it with EEG, so you can place electrodes on the scalp that are reasonably comfortable, and you can get a reading of the electrical activity in the cortex. And so that's another key thing about EEG and brain waves is that the activity that we're reading, all the activity that we're reading and seeing actually comes from several centimeters down into your cortex. And so there's a lot of structures underneath that. And that's kind of when the science of EEG kind of gets kind of deeper and more complex, is when you start getting these surface brain waves and start kind of extrapolating, okay, what are the circuits, here on the top that go deeper into the limbic system or the brainstem and then down into the body and so on and so forth. And so it becomes a very math heavy kind of science of figuring out what are the relationships between this huge amount of information that we're seeing just again from this upper part of the cortex, and how does that extrapolate into basically our experience of being us, whether that's the frontal attention components or parietal kind of sense of place or sense of self, or maybe temporally memory or identification of particular things. And so it becomes very divergent from that. And that's kind of how it becomes really complicated really quickly.
Yeah, for sure. So are there direct connections that they know about? Like, oh, I'm going to make something up. C3 attaches to the hippocampus. I have no idea, like that those EEG bands.
Somewhat, not with that level of So the way the connections are going to be much finer than that. So it would almost be like under C3, there are probably dozens upon dozens of potential networks that are readable under that particular electrode, that then diverge into other parts of the brain depending upon the context of what that activity is. So different types of activity may engage C3 somewhat differentially. In addition to that, there is some specificity to brain sites. And so we have, you could say that, FP1 is like executive attentional control and stuff like that. Or you could go for like, there's like Brodmann areas, right, which are numbered areas that correspond to different, anatomical areas that have different functional explanations. But I'd say on average, if I'm remembering this figure correctly, there's oftentimes like 40% of any given other brain region could potentially be activated by a process that is not directly hypothetically attaching to that. And so you may see things like areas of the brain that may be involved in language being slightly activated in a non-language process. And so there is that, almost parts of the brain are very specific towards very specific tasks. And we as humans have tried to be as reductionist as we can to be like, okay, is this track or is this area just for this? And we've made those maps, but the answer is ultimately that it's very fluid, and there's always going to be overlap, especially individually. Different people use their brains in very different ways, and how they use their brains in the long term is ultimately going to determine what areas they invoke when they engage with a particular process.
Okay. And there is something too about both synchrony and coherence, correct? So like, if I'm not mistaken, if you have stronger brain coherence across your whole brain, people that have that, longtime meditators, their whole brain is functioning better, which sort of seems to indicate what you're saying, that you can't just say, oh, this region right here goes directly to some, your hippocampus or some area like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so we have that that coherence, which is basically like a measure of almost like functional connectivity, which is like, coherence is almost like very basically like a measure of similarity, to say if is one area of the brain activating another area of the brain, efficiently. And as you said, we do see that increase in meditators, and that's almost an increased efficiency for the brain, because it's like you have one area of the brain that is able to almost recruit another area of the brain that it needs to engage with that particular task. And then perhaps in an untrained or a person that is naive to that process, they're going to have less coherence, as their brain is just not as well trained. Again, going back to the gym analogy, it's just not as well trained or as well toned at getting all those different areas to activate coherently together. And then you mentioned as well, we have synchrony as well. And so synchrony is taking one particular area of the brain, and then you could say that the alpha synchrony in that one area has increased, which is to say that it's almost toning up, right? And so that power or that synchrony is increased with the number of neurons that are firing in that precise rhythm. And so the more you train your brain to fire in those rhythms, the more they actually tone and fire together.
Mm-hmm.
And that produces overall like a more powerful, almost like a more powerful sound. I often use the analogy of, if you have a whole group of people like in an auditorium and they're all clapping at different rates, that's one sound. But if you actually get them all to clap over and over at the exact same time, that's a lot louder, because there's that increase in power, because it's almost like they're all working together to make the one big sound, as opposed to frittering their energy away in lots of different things that aren't as efficient, right?
So that reminds me of that old phrase, neurons that wire together, fire together, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and so that's like that product of neuroplasticity. You use it or lose it, and you get your neurons to fire together. Firing is that electrical discharge down that wire-like structure. And the more you do that, it actually sends out chemical signals to say, oh, we are actually repetitiously using this network. Therefore, it is efficient to recruit more resources to actually make this network better. It's almost like we drive this road all the time and there's all these traffic jams on it. So why don't we like pave it, make it an 8-lane highway, make it so it's like wide, it's smooth, there's good information transfer. And so your brain kind of does that through kind of a chemical signaling process.
Right, which is all the more reason to say that when you can train your brain through meditation or other means, that you are paving those highways for that synchrony and the neurons to wire and fire together and behave better, which is why neuroplasticity works and is so amazing, right?
Absolutely, yeah. They fire together, they wire together and fire together, they tone up, get stronger, and this increases over time. The more you do it, the better it gets, really.
Right, exactly. So if everybody here isn't meditating a couple hours a day, I don't know what's wrong with you.
Should be meditating now.
Leave, stop watching this, go meditate, because
it's important.
You don't need this information, you just need your brain to work correctly.
Think of how much better you could be focusing on us right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that reminds me too of Les Fermi's Open Focus book, where he's really big on alpha phase synchrony and creating synchrony across the brain. And Coach Tate developed an app you can get for free on the web called the Awareness app, for people who don't know. And it goes with, so it uses the Muse and it tracks alpha phase synchrony. So if you want a tool that you can, for free, and you've got a Muse, you can train for alpha synchrony using the Awareness app, which I think is pretty cool. So
nice.
Yeah. All right. So that, I feel like we're good. We've set the stage with neuroplasticity and brainwaves and what they are. So let's dive in a little bit more and talk about some of the specific brainwaves that go fire in these different regions and why we might train for certain ones. And so I don't know, maybe where do you like to start? Delta?
Yeah, I usually like to start low and then go high, I think.
Great. Well, why don't you kick us off with tell us about Delta. That's the sleep. That's the one that most people know because of sleep, right?
Yeah. Delta is critical to our sleep. And it's the one where if you're not getting Delta as you sleep, you will absolutely like feel that the day after. And so Delta, in addition to a lot of slow wave activities or a lot of slow wave brain waves, have a lot of I would almost call them like kind of fundamental functions, sometimes kind of housekeeping functions. Sometimes it's almost like very close to life functions is what I'd say. So there's like a cardiac rhythm that is received by the brain that is a very, very low frequency. There's kind of a pulmonary or a breathing rate that is also kind of received by the brain that's a very, very low frequency. And so a lot of that is, almost like why I call it that, almost like undercurrent kind of housekeeping of just that basal, slow, constant regulation of, kind of heartbeat, kind of breathing, and just the general like slow wave human activities that kind of pass through our physiology in different respects. And so it is most prominently seen, as we mentioned, in deep sleep. And so there are many different kind of phases of sleep that we go through. Kind of briefly, as you fall asleep, you kind of go through like an alpha, theta, and then eventually the deepest, which is the deep delta state. And so deep delta sleep is the phase of sleep that is incredibly hard to wake anybody out of. And so if you've ever had the experience where people are just really, really hard to wake up, and if you do wake them up, they're just so groggy, or it almost takes them a few minutes to kind of reorient to being awake. That is because you have awoken them in that deepest kind of delta wave sleep, and it's actually it's almost like the brain going offline in a weird way, to where, delta waves are responsible for a lot of like hormonal release, a lot of kind of nutrient uptake, things like that from the brain. So it's almost like all right, we're going to take the networks offline for a little bit, and we're going to go and do the repairs, kind of do the maintenance, improve the networks that need to be improved, or take it down, or do whatever we need to do. And so it's almost like a non-state, which is weird to say. Like all the others have very distinctive, all the other brainwaves have very distinctive cognitive states, but delta is almost a non-cognitive state in that capacity.
You're reminding me of the horrifying aspect of being a new parent, where you're like deep into your delta repair mode. It makes such perfect sense. And your baby cries and it hurts. It makes me want to shudder when I think about those days. I have twin girls, and I got woken up by my twins, and it was not pretty.
Oh no, something to look forward to for me. I don't have that experience quite yet, but I can imagine. And that's it's really interesting actually, talking about that interrupted sleep thing, because it actually leads into one of the things that people are experiencing right now in these kind of COVID-19 quarantine times, which is this dream phenomenon, where people are reporting kind of increased remembrance of dreams and just increased dreaming in general. And there's actually a very interesting kind of simple reason why a lot of that is occurring, and that's fundamentally most of us are overtired, but we actually have to get up for work, and we have to set our alarm, and oftentimes wake up at a time that is not natural for us to actually wake up. And so naturally your body and brain will not wake up in that deepest kind of delta sleep. It kind of goes down deep, and then it comes up shallow again, and that's when you wake up and you can feel refreshed. But usually very common experience is that experience where you wake up with your alarm, and you have to hit snooze a couple of times because you don't feel refreshed after sleep because you didn't wake up at a good time in your sleep cycle. But now more and more people don't have to get up because they're at home for quarantine, staying home and stuff like that. So they have the natural ability to more so give their brain the ability to wake up when it naturally wants to. And when you wake up in that shallower kind of brainwave, that not as deep brainwave state, you're actually much closer to your dreams, and you'll actually have much, much greater dream recall. And so oftentimes people that wake up in delta will say, sometimes you'll see people say, oh, I don't dream, or I never remember my dreams, or something to that extent, which is really not true. It's if you're not dreaming, that's a severe disorder, and you will feel that you probably are not going to work if you're not dreaming. And so what is happening is they're absolutely dreaming, probably having several dreams a night, but because they're waking up in that deep delta state, they're not remembering their dreams, and so they don't have that perception of dreaming. But if they allow themselves to wake up naturally, which is what is occurring much more often in these times when people are home, then they're going to perceive and remember their dreams much more closely, and that will have this perception of, oh, I think I had more dreams than I did previously, even though it may just be a very similar amount of dreaming. You're just remembering them more because of the different ways that your different brainwave states, and how you emerge from sleep is actually so critical to how you feel upon waking, and what your cognitive state is.
And so let's talk a little bit about meditation and delta. I mean, studies like Lee et al., the review study on neural oscillations, talked about overall meditators having, slowed down brain waves, long-term meditators. I think it was the Lee study. But as somebody who's recorded a lot of brain waves on the Muse in particular, I've noticed too that it's really sensitive to movement. So it can be really tricky to find out, are you actually, like, I've seen my delta waves go down, and I think a lot of that's just getting really, really, really still.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about the slower brain waves in meditation?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in the context of the more artifact stuff that you mentioned, or just
Maybe
in the
both.
general?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say before the artifact stuff, the kind of delta in the meditating brain, its increase is seen most predominantly actually not during meditation, but actually during sleep afterwards. And so there's actually the Lee paper, the review of the neural oscillations underlying meditation, has collected a number of studies that have seen that, as we meditate, whether it's kind of open monitoring, focused attention, and different things, that you can kind of go down into alpha, theta, mostly kind of dominated states, increases and decreases, but that at night when these meditators are sleeping, they actually have much more increased kind of delta waves. And basically what that translates into is you're actually just sleeping a lot better. And so that's kind of what they look at when they do sleep studies a lot of times, is that, okay, is this person entering a good delta? What is the power of that delta? Is it, adequate for the rest this person needs to be getting? And so it's interesting how meditation is more than just the time when you're awake sitting down meditating. It is actually toning up your brain in ways that pay off down the line, even going to affect those delta waves as you sleep, which is not something you are directly toning, so to speak, or training in that meditative process. It's something that is almost by proxy kind of improved along with that person's experience of just being more well rested, and having a healthier active time and a healthier rest time to balance that as well.
Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense too. As you quiet your mind, as you turn off the default mode network, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, as you do those things that happen naturally through a meditation practice, then that carries over into sleep. And that not having an anxious mind and having a mind that's recycling thoughts all the time and self-referential thinking would benefit sleep. That makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then when you link it back to what I said before about delta and all of that, nourishment uptake, hormonal release, that is, for healing and rejuvenation, and kind of like, taking it offline so you can improve it so that when it comes back online, it's even better. You can see how meditation, improving those delta waves, would really have a lot of impact on you, neurologically speaking.
Completely.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. And then it is, for people who are recording devices real quickly, it is, they're sensitive to delta. So you do have to be a little careful of that, right?
Yeah. And so that's one of the most common things. And then that's a very, very common source of kind of error or artifacts or just kind of bad data in EEG studies, is a lot of the kind of facial nerve activity. So anytime you move, maybe like your eyelids, your brow, your eyebrows, anything like that, your jaw, tense your jaw, move your tongue, anything like that people kind of a lot of times subconsciously do as we enter these relaxed states. In addition, also any eye movement, so movement of the eyeball itself. Eyeballs are actually electromagnetic dipoles, interestingly enough. So actually moving them is like moving these giant magnetic fields in your head, which is kind of this crazy thing. But that actually puts a lot of weird activity on an EEG electrode that is connected to the scalp, that is basically like also picking up all of these electrical activity that is basically kind of propagating kind of through those nerves, maybe through the skin, and it's being picked up by those electrodes, especially the frontal electrodes. And that's why you'll see a lot of that, like Muse, for example, being extremely sensitive to that kind of contamination. It is that the two of the main electrodes that Muse has are right here, and that's going to pick up every little kind of eye thing that you're doing in any kind of subtle way, which is often troubling, because when people enter, again, those kind of deep states, you get very still, but then you get to a point where you kind of release, you're not controlling your body. It's like, what are my eyes doing? I don't even care what my eyes are doing when you're that deep, right? And so, and there's a lot of like little movements as well, that will cause a lot of, kind of very like almost like loud contamination. If you think about the brain as almost like producing these little sounds, these little electrical things that, these electrode microphones are picking up. The electrical activity of the brain is pretty nuanced, pretty subtle, and it's within a pretty fine kind of range of activity, I would say, compared to the cranial nerves, which are like these much more loud, booming, kind of slow but powerful kind of waves. And so that's why, they're very, very easily picked up by anything that picks up anything that's on that kind of frontal forehead area. And so in a lot of EEG experiments, what you have to do is basically kind of account for that. There's multiple ways you can do that. There's sometimes like machine learning where you can say, this is what a blink looks like. Like blinks have a very distinctive, same as like jaw movements, there's a very distinctive morphology to that waveform. And if you can identify that or get a machine to do that, you can say, okay, go through my million data points, find anything that looks like a blink and excise it.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one way you can do it, or you can just visually do it, or, another common way is to, record a long time period and then visually examine that to see, okay, where are the chunks of good uncontaminated data, and then pull those out for your analysis. And so there's a lot of that has to be done when you're doing EEG studies.
Okay. Great. Okay, well, let's move on to theta, one of the more interesting ones from a meditation perspective. You want to kick it off and tell us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So theta is a really interesting one, and I'd almost say classically it's almost the goal one that people, I don't want to say like gamma is kind of the hot one now, that I don't, they all have their merits, but I think theta is the one that is often associated with the depth of that, almost like a visual state, almost like a mystical state, almost like basically like a state to where you've been meditating and you've descended to a point where you've gotten somewhere, right? Wherever that is, I don't know, and that is often marked by this kind of deep theta state. And so I often see that when we're doing, particularly as well, I've seen this in a few expert meditators as well, to where they can very, very quickly get down to that very deep, still state. And it's like between a 7 and an 8 hertz. So it's right in that kind of theta range. And so a lot of that is oftentimes frontal, in addition to kind of temporal as well, kind of somewhat parietal. And so it's interesting, it almost kind of comes around frontally, and then it comes in like in a band almost to around the sides, the temporal regions, sometimes the parietal regions as well. And it's interesting, different mystical experiences a little bit can sometimes have different thetas associated with them, at least in terms of the specificity for the electrodes. I know the Beauregard study, who studied in 2006, he studied Carmelite nuns and their mystical experience of basically union with God. And I believe it was left-sided FP1 to C3 was increased theta coherence for them when they entered that state of, that kind of mystical union that I think is involved with their Christian prayer kind of tradition, stuff like that.
Yeah, they had some gamma. They had some right-sided gamma as well, but since we're on the theta, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a really interesting thing that frontal temporal seems to be the main, at least so far that I've seen, some of the main kind of sources of theta that people are getting into. And I would almost call it it's a beyond the novice state. It's something that's very accessible if people have the consistency and training to kind of just stick with the stillness and practice, stick to a breathing regime or something like that. And it is, it's an accessible state for a human being to go down into that. And it's almost, I would say, a hybrid state. It's interesting, because we talk about, awake versus, asleep versus, dreaming, and theta is almost like that. I almost kind of consider it somewhat of a hybrid state, because the person in that state, they're not really awake in the traditional way, but they're definitely not sleeping either. So it's very, very different from sleep, but they're in a very, very deep, still kind of state of mind. And often it is within that platform, that theta platform, that a lot of this kind of mystical union, or a lot of deep spiritual experiences begin to take shape, whether that's through kind of sensation, or oftentimes that's where people will report kind of visually things begin to kind of filter in.
Yeah. One thing I noticed, and I think in my own personal experience, yeah, I've seen theta increase actually all over long term, but also for me, when I track my brainwaves, watching the temporal theta is a huge clue to how deep the meditation went. Like that's the one that I seem to be able to see the most clearly. If I look at on the Muse TP9 and 10, I can kind of be like, oh, that was a deep spot. And just I can see where those theta raises are, and they correlate with deeper meditations really nicely in terms of matching with my experience. So I guess that's temporal. So that's really kind of this whole, and I see it in the front too, but I think it's masked by other focused attention and other things that are going on. Whereas it's more of like a pure theta signal from the rear, if that makes sense.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and that's what we see. I think that's very similar to what those Carmelite nun studies found. And a lot of other kind of similar studies are kind of finding that as well. And yeah, as you mentioned, like we kind of see that as well in our own meditations, and myself as well, to where that particular depth that is beyond the normal depth is that theta kind of space.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. Yeah, so it seems like it's hugely important in terms of from a meditative state. What's interesting too about theta is that like frontal theta is also associated with some like ADD and other kind of physical challenges too. So that's kind of an interesting contrast. We're talking about on the one hand, it's good for meditation. On the other hand, it can be a health issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it shows the importance of how context heavily matters in an EEG study, and the context of what you're doing will dramatically change the interpretation. And so there's a huge body of EEG knowledge that is about non-meditative states, right? And so in the average waking non-meditative state, a high degree of frontal theta is basically, it's not a good thing. It's actually considered like poor attentional control. It's almost like having a lack of resources to actually engage with what you are wanting to. The experiential side of that is almost wanting to sit down and maybe read or write or focus on a particular task, but you're not attaching to it. You're not focusing on it. You're not engaged 100%, and you can't quite get your mind hooked on that task. That's kind of a theta phenomenon, to where what your brain, especially in those frontal areas, kind of wants to do is be in that somewhat mid beta kind of range for that kind of focused attention. But due to ADD or injury or exhaustion or nutritional issues and deficiencies or whatever it is, you just don't have the resources or the energy to get your attention, to turn that dial up to where you want it to be, to where you can get the engine going and get that attentional control going. And so it's interesting that, we use that theta beta ratio a lot of times as, I believe it's actually like an FDA approved diagnostic marker now for ADHD.
And also went up in a recent meditation study.
And that's the Carmelite nun study. They found increased theta beta ratio in the frontal areas. And so there's two reasons for that. One reason I'll mention is that I think theta beta ratios something has happened to them to where they're not as reliable. The positive predictive value of a theta beta ratio does not seem to be what it's supposed to be, given that it got FDA clearance to be a diagnostic marker. It seems a lot of studies are coming out that show high theta beta ratios in people with okay attentional skills and that don't have ADD or ADHD, which is interesting. And so the jury's still out on whether, okay, is that an experimental methodology thing to where people aren't controlling appropriately and it's skewing the data to have ADD not be as easily diagnosed, or what I think is, or is it something to where theta beta ratios just aren't as predictive as we once thought and it was a mistake? So there's that kind of sidebar, but I think a much greater picture is that we need to begin to, and this has already begun, but starting to differentiate between meditative EEG brainwaves and phenomenon and states, and what we traditionally correlate with those brainwaves and those states in a normal kind of clinical or medical context, because the two appear to be different. Obviously, the Carmelite nuns aren't inducing ADD in their brain through this process of their prayer. It is not something that makes sense, but it is showing the same way that we would measure ADD. And so that to me points to, again, meditative state of mind is but there are many different states of mind, and you kind of have to really pay attention to what the context is to really fully explore what the brain waves are telling you. And really, for a lot of this meditation stuff, we're just now learning and mapping what are all these different brainwave states, how they differ between all these different forms of meditation, and really, almost like categorizing and seeing, how different is open monitoring versus focused attention versus subtle energy meditation versus, X, Y, and Z. And so we're really now getting the gears up and running in humanity for finally mapping and understanding these kind of unique electrophysiological states.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Okay, so so we're at theta. We're 50 minutes into it.
Yeah.
So everybody,
10 minutes left. All right, alpha, beta, gamma.
Yeah, right.
There's nothing there anyway. Nothing of importance.
No, nothing to see. But we can just skip to gamma and be real quickly, because alpha, I mean, there was this whole alpha craze in the 80s, and I'm a huge fan of Les Fermi's book, Open Focus Brain, and he's a big alpha proponent. And I think, and I talk to my clients about this a lot, about learning to dwell in the alpha state, increasing your alpha brain so that you are living in a more rested state of being.
Absolutely, yeah.
Opposed to kind of crazy beta brain thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems to be like alpha is that it's almost like a very energy efficient state, almost from the biophysical point of view. If you were to call, one of the brain waves a default wave, I wouldn't go down that road for argument's sake, but if you were to, alpha is kind of that, almost like midline from which brain waves kind of go lower or higher, depending upon the activity. And so alpha, again, depending upon the context and the location, it differs, but alpha can a lot of times be that flow state to where you're not actively engaged in something, but you are poised and ready to. And so that's kind of why it's often associated with those kind of sports related flow states, because it's like you're not, because when you're, imagine for an athlete, when you're in that flow state, you're not really thinking about the mechanics of anything. You're just doing with it. It's just a flow. There's not all these little pieces of information that you're considering and analyzing. There's no beta, which would be you focusing on, oh, if he throws the ball this way, then I should take 2 steps to the left and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you're in that alpha state, which is it's almost like pure receptivity. So it's like ready to engage with the world as soon as the world presents you with something that is willing to be engaged with, so to speak. So you're poised and ready to act in whatever way you need to act. It's almost like the engine's in neutral. You can put it in gear whenever you need to, but it's going, it's revving, it's on, and can be engaged when you need it to. And then in addition to that, the perception or what you kind of feel outside of a flow state context for alpha is that, as you mentioned, that calmness. It's associated with getting out of that kind of beta brain, busy, anxious mind and down into that calm, really being poised, as I mentioned before, is really like about living in the moment, right? You're receptive. You're not actively engaging in anything, but you're receptive to whatever could be engaged with. And so it's that ultimate like calm, receptive kind of state, almost like the ideal kind of Buddha walking around state,
Sounds to me like living in awake awareness, which is
Yeah, exactly.
goal for, I think, a laudable goal that we can all.
Yeah. And then so quickly on the meditation side of things, so alpha, you'll see a lot of increases in, or a lot of kind of variation of alpha activity and alpha toning, alpha synchrony, phase synchrony and stuff like that, that is associated with alpha. And so alpha is often one of the ones that is seen to change most immediately. Like for example, with Muse, if somebody was to strap on in Muse, that's what you will see change most easily immediately, is that alpha, when you descend into that, initial states of that depth and calmness, before you kind of reach that kind of theta. It's almost like that pre-theta zone.
And we didn't, we haven't chatted about this recently, but also the relationship with supplements. I mean, there's a supplement literally called Alpha Brain. I talk to my clients about, you can take L-theanine or 5-HTP, some of these supplements to promote Alpha Brain. I think omega-3s and fish oils are linked to promoted Alpha Brain. So there is the supplement side as well as
like a green tea and stuff.
Green tea that promotes those alpha waves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so and that really shows how, I got my cat in the frame here. Sorry. It shows how it wants to join in. Cats have brainwaves too, funnily enough.
He probably lowers or activates alpha waves just petting your cat. There's probably
does actually. There's some unique stuff that goes on there. But with the L-theanine and the green tea and the supplement stuff, it really shows how unified the brain and the body are. And so really, that nutritional aspect of taking care of yourself and treating your body in the best way it can, giving your body the best nutrients that it can, that is directly treating your brain the best way that it can. And so, things like digestion heavily affect what nourishment your brain gets, and that heavily affects what brain waves will be exhibited. And if they're if you have healthy brain waves, or if you have a very, very poor diet, you can kind of have maladaptive brain waves, because you don't have the energy, basically. Again, you might be in that theta zone, in the frontal theta zone, where you don't have the resources to actually have the energy to raise into higher brain waves for those more concentration heavy, resource dependent functions.
Seems like that's a whole area in and of itself that could be like next 21st century thing, is really understanding different nutritional aspects to the body and promoting various healthy brain waves.
And that's why one of the biggest things that I like when I was doing when I do coaching for people, or when people are curious about what is the best way for them to kind of immediately improve, like what are things I can do quickly to immediately improve, 100% diet is the thing that you can do. Diet, exercise, just the general things you can do for your body have tremendous effects on your brain. And so if you have a functional kind of gut brain system, so if you're digesting well, and really a lot of like your microbiome, for example, all the bacteria in your gut, a lot of what they do is break down materials for you so that they are available to be taken up by your brain. So interestingly enough, like our bodies, in the absence of our bacteria, don't have the ability to break down most of the food that we eat into a form that is actually ready to be taken up by the brain and processed, and other parts of the body as well. But if you have a very, very healthy microbiome, then that heavily allows your brain to have a very active source, a very, healthy source of consistent nutrients that leads into that neuroplasticity. So the neurons that fire together, wire together, they need resources to do that, right? And your brain is a very resource heavy organ. And so really taking care of that, gut health, digestive health, and cardiovascular health, and all the other health, different ways you can improve your health really does directly impact your brain waves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
I'm
it's,
sure you can put sleep in there too. It's a chicken.
yeah, of course. Yeah. Sleep. So healthy activity, but also healthy rest, right? It's all about that balance between the two. You want a lot of, that good sympathetic activity that is balanced by that good parasympathetic activity. You want not one or the other, but both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. So moving on up the ladder, so to speak, beta. And
Beta.
yeah, I'd love for you to touch a little bit too on SMR, because clients who are doing neurofeedback, we talk about how SMR can be really helpful. So yeah, anyway, tell us about beta.
Yeah. So beta rhythms it's a very active, it's kind of, it's a step up from alpha, right? And it has a much wider bandwidth than the previous brainwave. So, we consider alpha between like 8 and 12 hertz, for example. And then beta could almost be 12 and 30, 12 and 25, depending. Everybody has a different kind of metric that they use, but around that range. And beta is invoked in very active processes. So it's the one that's most responsible, especially in like frontal areas, for focused attention. So when you're really like focused on one particular task and you're giving it your all, or you're in class and you're trying to listen to what somebody's saying, you really want to uptake and focus that information. Beta is that kind of higher frequency that kind of handles those a little bit more focused kind of phenomenon. And there is that sensory motor rhythm as well that is responsible for beta. And so it's interesting. Beta is almost the alpha of the muscular system in a weird way. And so there are parts of the brain that are controlling almost like the flow of information inward and how that relates to you and your body, basically. And that can be at a resting state at a kind of a low, mid kind of beta range. And so
Like
when
13 to 15, right?
Yeah, 13 to 15. And then like 18 is kind of within like the muscular range a little bit as well. And then a lot of times people that train that, and I think you've probably seen this as well in your own practice, in your own coaching, where they almost have, I would almost advise it for a lot of people that have are almost on edge with their environment, or almost like it's almost like that feeling of being somewhat unsafe or nervous, and that's based upon you being somewhat at ease with your environment. And that can kind of have this sensory motor rhythm, right? So motor is your basically muscle, brain down to muscle control, and then sensory is the sensory information that is being kind of uptaken. And so kind of people that have that people that have that kind of rhythm run away from them a little bit can kind of have that little bit more of that high anxiety type of a phenomenon, that is kind of, they're operating at too high of a state, right? It's just too anxious, it's too uneasy, and then you need to kind of bring that down to kind of, it's almost like acquiescing them with their environment in a weird way and getting them to come down into that balanced kind of brainwave pattern, to where the in-stream of information in that sensory motor rhythm is just more appropriate, more balanced, and is not being, squirreled away into weird anxious kind of thoughts or parts of the brain, or weird, repetitive thoughts, or things of that nature.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense when I think about the way, some of the techniques that we use to activate the parasympathetic system, like, breathing, coherent breathing techniques, for example, where you're consciously slowing down the breaths, to a 6 count in, 6 count out, or 4 count box breath. So you're slowing your breathing down and then relaxing. And what you find is that you're promoting those calmer brain waves. And so the fact that beta is linked to activity, and if you naturally tell your body through breathing or other types of conscious resting activity that you would feel your brain quiet. Those two obviously are integrally linked.
Yeah, yeah, and I would always be a huge proponent about just how, again, just how breathing practices are amazing tools about going down the line and impacting those deeper rhythms, about, you know, getting people to that calmer, steady state. And then in addition, doing that repetitiously and training that and having that state become a trait to where they're just more calm, you know, in general, and have a more attuned rhythm,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah, I've been trying out soma breathing this week as experiment, and it's a lot like the Kriya breathing I'd been doing. But yeah, it's quite powerful. It's you know, and you feel, you know, they talk about you going into heart coherence, and you know, with this rhythmic, you're doing this rhythmic spinal breathing to music, and I definitely feel it. I feel like I'm going into coherence. It's cool.
Absolutely, and that raises another excellent point about breathing. I think is that it's not something that's kind of woo-woo. It's very physiologically based, and so that's something that I use when I communicate with people, because we exist in this realm where, you know, we're scientists, right? But we also exist in this meditation sphere, which invokes a lot of heavy spirituality and a lot of weird kind of stuff, right?
What are you talking about?
We talk about the rabbit holes and stuff like that. And
yep.
I mentioned to people that, you know, okay, there's a lot of skeptics out there, right? They go, okay, meditation, what even is that? Is this some weird chanting stuff based on Eastern? Does this even work? And they're so skeptical. And the way to almost onboard those people onto the process and convince them, it's like, hey, we're actually doing something real here. We're not just out in fantasy land doing whatever, is to actually teach them a breathing, you know, box breathing or diaphragmatic breathing, or a very particular breathing regime, because that, A, you can immediately feel the results from that in a single session, and B, you can very much feel that training and toning, you know, up or down your nervous system, you know, depending upon what needs require, in a very profound physiological way, almost whether you quote unquote believe or not, right? That's the kind of good thing about it, you know, being as physiological that it is that whether you're, you know, an atheist or a Buddhist or a Christian or whatever you want to be or believe in, your body does operate on these principles, and you are available to use them at a moment's notice. All it takes is just the motivation to actually go in and spend a few minutes breathing or what have you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I wrote a blog recently about the links between heart and heart coherence and brain activity, and, you know, just making people aware of basic things like, you know, your heart sends 60 times more signals to your brain than your brain sends to your heart. So, you know, I think a lot of us think about our brains as kind of being this control center that is sending messages everywhere, as opposed to the receiving center that's processing, you know, information from everywhere.
Right. Exactly.
Which I think it at least from the research that I did on heart coherence really woke me up to that reality that, like, oh, if you control the physiology, if you do these things to control physiology, like coherent breathing, for example, you change your brain. You send the signals to your brain that alters it, the brainwave patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. And in very powerful ways. So.
Yeah. And that's hard science stuff. You can't change.
Yeah, exactly. That's just biology. That's
biology.
Yeah.
Physiology, biology. Cool. Okay, well, let's dive back into some of the mystical stuff.
Yeah, going back to gamma
so
now.
Let's talk about gamma. Yeah.
Okay. So gamma is a very interesting. So gamma is the quickest. And it's almost so. Classically, gamma was always referred to in previous decades as like the mystery band, right? Because there was even a contention over whether it even existed or not, or whether human brains had activity at that high frequency. We now know that like they absolutely do, and they are crucial and integral, just as any other brainwave is, into so many different processes. And so gamma is typically from that, maybe that 30 hertz range up to whatever you want to name a number.
Into lambda, you know, and higher.
Yeah, you know, you could see, you know, studies go up to 100 hertz. I've seen studies go up to 200 hertz. And so I've even seen studies that are invoking higher frequencies than that now. And a factor of why we're kind of just learning that now is it takes a lot of sophisticated technology to actually read gamma waves. They're very, very fast, very kind of quick. Sometimes they kind of burst and then they go away, and they burst and kind of come back. And so they're very like elusive and hard to spot without a lot of, very good EEG equipment that can actually measure these fast frequencies reliably and kind of see what's going on. And so as time goes on and as hardware both advances and becomes cheaper, so it goes into more hands, we're going to see this kind of gamma bandwidth. At least what I would like to see is that it becomes more well-defined, right? Because for me to say, oh, gamma between 30 and 150 hertz, that's like, okay, well, what is that? That's like a million different things that you could be talking about that are many different perceptions, many different processes. There could be thousands of different potential processes that are coordinated by gamma at that level. We just don't know. And so time will tell as we dive deeper more and more what gamma is doing and kind of where it's going. But we already have a lot of we're seeing a lot of what gamma is doing, at least in the meditative brain. To speak to that, it seems to be associated with these very deep experiences or very profound experiences that are exhibited by people that are trained meditators or expert meditators, or people that have basically given themselves to one particular practice of meditation for many years and can reliably enter that state. I know, one of the features of when they studied Buddhist practitioners entering that state was that it was almost this all-encompassing, compassionate state to where, going into kind of Buddhist ideology, a lot of the ideal there is to kind of get to a state where you can feel compassion with all beings, right? One of the main points being, if you're enlightened, you almost don't want to leave the earth until every blade of grass is also enlightened, if you took that particular route. And so it's interesting that these Buddhist meditators, when they're meditating for decades and decades almost, they can enter that very deep kind of still state for them that is marked by overwhelming feelings of compassion. And what that looks like in the brain is these high frequency kind of gamma readings. Mm-hmm. But then there are also, so we do some work in, subtle energy meditation and kind of elucidating what the mechanics of that are, which is a lot of, you mentioned Kriya yoga. And so that's kind of similar where it's, chi or prana based practices. And those practices seem to activate gamma a lot as well. So a very active kind of, almost very active meditations seem to be more proponents towards that gamma phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And the sustainment of a particular gamma state seems to be a product of, again, that training. So that people entering, doing whatever their meditation is for such a long period of time that they can then enter almost whatever the ideal of whatever that meditation form is for, several minutes or more, depending upon the particular practice, and having that be marked by gamma. And so the question is like, okay, so why gamma? Why would that show up? And kind of what is it doing? Gamma is, as we mentioned, extremely fast. And so what we know about gamma is that it has the property of being able to almost be a shepherd for the other brain waves. It's a binding brainwave or a unifying brainwave. And so what I kind of hypothesize to be happening in the brains of these expert meditators is that, there is a lot of alpha, there's a lot of theta, there's a lot of other brain waves being, coordinated in their brain. And basically it's almost like gamma could potentially be syncing up and coordinating activity between different sites in a particular way to almost like set up maybe perhaps what could be like an ideal brainwave state for that particular meditation.
Like
And
sounds like a super coherence almost of
yeah, it's almost like that coherence between kind of brain waves and between processes. And it's interesting as well that gamma, comes as the result of this intense training, right? And so that would kind of support that, to be like, okay, when you start having these huge increases in coherence, or your brain is activating in very specific ways and recruiting other parts of the brain and doing this and that, that in a very high level brain that can be coordinated by this very higher level fast frequency that is then able to coordinate the frequencies that are slower than it.
How
And
much? Sorry.
I would just say that, gamma is like the shepherd of all the brain's kind of
Yeah.
sheep. It
Yeah.
keeps them all, you can, get them going one way or the another.
How much do you buy or believe that gamma, yeah, it's triggering this super coherence hyperconscious state, but from a hormonal perspective, how much do you buy the idea that it might be triggering release of DMT in the pineal gland, triggering these, non-dual states, which can be triggered by, say, psychedelics, but also clearly by meditative states. And then just thinking about pulling in all the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, all the sort of mystique around the pineal gland. Seems like there's a there. What do you think?
Yeah. It's something that I think potentially, like, that is kind of where we seem to be going. And like, it's almost like, as a scientist, I would like hold my opinion until it kind of comes out, because I think it's the and ultimate question.
Crystals in the
right. And yeah, crystals in the pineal gland, which is true as well, by the way. That's another thing that's just biology, as they say. But I think ultimately the picture would be kind of more complex than that. That's my kind of suspicion, is that we focus on the reductionist, right? So we go, okay, gamma releasing DMT, and we kind of link those two in a linear kind of way, when I think for those more profound, impactful experiences, there's going to be a lot more tryptamines that are involved, so a lot more serotonin related things that are involved. And I think as well, for that is very much true when you study the longer term psychedelics, so like LSD or psilocybin, where it's a much more longer course of serotonergic or tryptamine type of activity. And I think as well is that, again, it's always a mixed bag. I always say it's always like, we always want to get the gamma to do the one thing that we want it to do, right? But the truth is that, gamma is not going to be able to do what it wants to do without theta, and theta is not going to be able to do it without alpha. And you kind of like, each one is almost leaning on each other to form a much greater structure.
Yeah.
And so it's always about, just like it's about like mind-body unity, as we mentioned before, and the digestive and the heart system and stuff. I think the future in those states is going to be about brainwave unity, and not what is the dominant brainwave in this state, but what is the particular blend of, what are the tapestry of brainwaves that exist for this particular state, and how is it different for other states. And so I always, it's going to be about bringing together so many more things and linking the chemical nature of what is released with the the electrical nature, and which of those chemicals are excitatory and will actually increase brain waves, and which are inhibitory, and kind of so on. And so I think, TBD is kind of the short answer to your question. But I eagerly await and engage in that research. So
great. Well, I'll bring you back on in a year, and hopefully
we'll figure it out. That's what I always like to say. I always go into these interviews and I get some of those questions, and I'm like, well, probably ask me in 10 years and I'll have a very, very different answer than I would give you now. Or, neuroscience is really in this kind of golden age right now. As I mentioned before a little bit, the technology that we have is, so rapidly evolving in its sophistication, in addition to how many people can actually access that technology. And so this is really dramatically changing the way that we view our brain. If you spoke to a neuroscientist 20 years ago, odds are you would get the classical view of the brain that, you're born with a certain amount of neurons, and if you lose them or if something happens, then you're just stuck and you can't change your brain, or it's not, like the old-fashioned neuroscientific view of the brain was that it's like static and it's a brain in a vat that is just not connected to anything, and it's chunk gets taken out, then you're screwed. It's, but actually what we're finding is the brain is an extremely fluid organ, and all those old paradigms are completely flipped on their head just in the past couple of decades. And when you kind of zoom out from that and try and almost like observe it mindfully, right? Observe it as the impartial observer, you're like, well, we're actually just in the thick of it now. We're in the midst of this huge kind of revolutionary change to where we are now just getting to grips with, brainwaves and what they are. And I mentioned we're just now mapping meditative brainwave states. And it's really a fascinating time period, because a lot of what we know, even as years go by, 1 year, even as months go by, every so often new studies are coming month by month that are like, oh, this is a crazy new phenomenon, or oh, there's this new activity we've never seen before in very high gamma ranges, or in deeper states, or what have you. And so it's always a fluid tapestry that is continuously being weaved as we go forward. Yeah.
Totally. And, I feel like, thank God for neuroplasticity, or, we'd all be sunk with all the beer we drank in college.
Yeah, exactly. That would just be the course of somebody's life, is you go through school, primary school, secondary school, and then you get to college, and then it starts to waver, and then your brain just like
all your brain cells.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Or when I have a client or other people, and they say, oh, my brain's just getting old, and I bristle now, and I just think, that's not the attitude to have. I mean, I just watched a film with Tibetan meditators who were, obviously they were all in their 70s, 80s, 90s, sharp as tacks from what I could tell on the video. And I just feel like, there's no reason these days with what we know about neuroplasticity to sort of have this opinion that my brain is just getting old. There is so much you can do, and I just don't buy it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. It's really not an excuse anymore. And that's kind of what we're finding, is that kind of anybody at any age can kind of do anything that they want to do. Really what the factor is that limits that is motivation. So people do whatever they want to do is basically the underscore of that, to where motivation is the factor that will take you to where you want to go. And it's not a factor of, oh, I'm too old, or, I've had a lot of people where maybe you coach like some of these like older business guys or whatever, and they're like, oh, I'm just set in my ways, I'm just going to do what I'm doing, and that you just can't change it. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. And it's actually, you put like your Point Dexter hat on. It's like, actually, scientifically speaking, no, it's none of that's true. And the brain is completely dynamic, and that's the truth as well for people that are people that want to be really good at math. Just do a lot of math and train your brain in that way. Or people that are like, oh, I wish I was an amazing linguist so I could learn all these languages, like my relative who can learn all these languages, but I just don't have the brain for that. And it's like, well, actually, the kids that are good at math typically have a brain for math because they do a lot of math, and people notice that and they put them in more math classes. And so it's like that feedback loop. Same with the linguistics, to where if somebody notices you're good at something as a kid, you often get put in those classes more and more, and then you use that skill more, and that's what is actually building more and more up the skill level. And so theoretically, anybody can start anywhere, and if they want to use that motivation to kind of put their head down, practice and train wherever the task is, and your brain will respond in kind and actually tone up and plasticize towards whatever areas or whatever ways you're training it.
Completely. And it really goes back to the beginning part of the conversation about paving the highways. Like, you can choose which highways you want to pave, and you have to do it. Just do the thing that you want to do, and you'll start creating those highways. And first there'll be 2 tracks, and then there'll be dirt roads. We have lots of those in Wyoming, and then pretty soon you'll have them paved, and you'll be like, oh, I'm actually good at a musical instrument or whatever I wanted to learn. So.
Absolutely. And it does work in kind of both directions. So like there is kind of negative neuroplasticity, to where that can be how depression or anxiety can sometimes be very, very hard to break that cycle, right? And so when you have somebody who's very depressed or anxious, and somebody says, well, just don't even think that thought, just don't even go that way. And it's like, actually, their brain has been inadvertently trained to kind of go down that path. And so that's why it takes the greater kind of intervention to, pull somebody out of that deep mire of a depression, because if they've been depressed for a long, long time, their brain circuitry is almost very much used to that. And so that's why you kind of need to reverse it and kind of put that in a positive direction. And then basically it's like the way that you use your brain will determine how good your brain is at doing whatever it's doing. And so very kind of negative thoughts can oftentimes cycle back at you, which is very important to have that, mindfulness interventions and stuff like that. And that's why that's so key in that neural training, and a lot of the brainwaves effects that we see in even superficial meditations is, dealing and breaking a lot of those thought patterns that we all build up just as the normal course of life, just as a lot of the weird associations or maybe negative reflexive thoughts that we have about ourselves, or things like that. Or maybe it's things that other people told you growing up that became kind of ingrained and stuff like that. And meditation is almost like unearthing those roots and relaying them in the proper configuration.
Yep, planting a new garden, eh?
Exactly. And so sow those good seeds of the things that you want in your life. And if you, again, it's that motivation. If you plant those seeds and you nurture the seeds of the plants that you want to grow, those are the plants that will grow, and you will have what you want, basically. That's
absolutely. And I loved, you said it earlier and I wanted to comment on it, this idea of a tapestry of brainwaves. And I think sometimes we as scientists, get, and people who are practitioners, get into thinking about the alpha, theta brainwaves, but really those are artificial. We've put names on them. We've created those divisions. They don't exist actually for real.
Yeah.
We created them. And so to move to this idea of the fluidity of these different brainwaves, and to think about, this faster brainwave kind of catalyzing coherence broadly across the spectrum of all the brainwaves, to me, and try to get out of our box of the categorization, because I think we can get a little fixated on that, and I'm not sure that's really serving us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that will have to kind of grow and evolve as we kind of emerge into this new era with all these new understandings. We'll see that the old models that we've developed just don't fit the layer of complexity and all the nuance that we're seeing coming from the brain.
It's undoubtedly more complex and more nuanced than we think.
Yeah. So I think I said at the beginning, it's like one of the most complex things in the universe, and we're just like, right. I think it's like the brain and the universe are the two most complex things. It's like whether you want the thing in your skull or everything, pick one. That's the two most difficult things you could say.
And remembering that anytime we talk about science like this, we're just building a model, we're categorizing. Ultimately speaking, everything you can keep. It's infinite, right? There's no bottom. The universe is infinite. So we have to remember that it's in this fabric of context of infinite consciousness. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Well, maybe that's a good place to end it. We've gone
about an hour and a half. Yeah.
Okay, I can go for another 2 hours. How about you?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're gonna have to have you back on if you're willing.
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah.
Great, because I'd really love to talk to you about some of the devices that are coming out.
Yeah, a lot of them are emerging onto the market at this point.
Yeah, transcranial stimulation, some other things like that we could wade into. Yeah, so.
Absolutely, yeah. Anytime.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate having you on to give us all the nitty-gritty scientific background on brainwaves, and I'm sure the listeners and viewers do too. So thank you so much, Kiefer. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, it's something that, people that know me know I love to ramble about this stuff. So any opportunity to do that is gold in my book.
Awesome. And where can people find you if they, I know you're a consultant and you offer services. I know one thing that Kiefer does is you still probably do EEG readings, and you'll interpret Muse brainwaves if people want to give you. So tell us a little bit about those services.
Yeah, so if people are interested in kind of learning more about some of my services and kind of more about me, I have a website that I opened somewhat recently, so ponderbrain.com. PONDER brain.com. And there they can find some of the previous interviews that I've done, some articles and some information on how to get in touch with me and that EEG stuff and so on. And so, and I'm always on Facebook. I try to be on less these days, but you can find me there every so often. Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Holly.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And you can find me at heartmindalchemy.com. I am a human potential coach and really excited to work with people who want to work personally in one-on-one coaching setting on meditation and cognitive performance and neurofeedback as well. And so, yeah, drop me a line if you're interested. And I also have a new Patreon site. So if you like these interviews and you want to throw $1 in the bucket or support me at a few bucks a month, it would be awesome. Patreon is HeartMind Alchemy, is patreon.com/HeartMindAlchemy. So yeah, and with that, we're gonna have Cody Rawl on next week. Super excited about that. So
I'm excited for that as well. Yeah, for the first time, the interviewer gets interviewed. So
yeah,
he's always on the flip side. So
yeah, it's gonna be great. So all right, thanks everybody. Take care.
Take care.
Yeah.